I need to tell you something that has been keeping me up at night, and I'm going to be completely honest with you. I might be wrong about some of this, but I don't think I am. I just spent 3 days reading through over 1,200 comments from people all over the world reacting to Trump's speech at Davos, and what I found terrified me more than Trump's actual words. You know what the most common reaction was? It wasn't anger. It wasn't even surprise. It was recognition. A 66-year-old man from Germany wrote, "As a German, I can only agree with everything you say. You Americans take care of your society, otherwise you will wake up tomorrow in a fascist dictatorship." Another commenter, also from Germany, said their defense minister is expecting an apology for Trump defaming the 59 German NATO heroes who paid with their lives in Afghanistan. But then they added something that stopped me cold. "We probably will not get an apology. We all know how the American president is functioning." Here's what terrifies me. The people who should recognize fascism, who have it seared into their generational memory, who grew up visiting concentration camps and learning never again, those people are screaming warnings at us. And we were not listening. Let me back up. Because I need to explain what actually happened in Davos. And I think once you understand it, you will see why the entire world is watching America with horror. Donald Trump arrived late to the World Economic Forum. Not fashionably late, deliberately, disrespectfully late, as if the gathering of world leaders was his personal rich kid playground. This is a man who cannot be on time for anything unless it directly enriches him or feeds his ego, and Davos did neither. But when he finally showed up, what followed was not just embarrassing, it was revealing. He started by mocking Emmanuel Macron's sunglasses. Petty, right? Then he belittled Canada's prime minister. He sneered at Swiss sovereignty. He mocked Denmark for being defeated in World War II. And you might think, okay, typical Trump, being a bully, being crude. But underneath all that bluster, there was something more disciplined happening, something more dangerous, because Trump wasn't just insulting individual leaders. He was laying out a vision of the West as an embattled racial civilization under siege, with himself cast as its last credible defender. Now, I want you to hear his exact words because they matter. He said, "Certain places in Europe are not even recognizable, frankly, anymore. They not recognizable. And we can argue about it, but there's no argument. Friends come back from different places. I don't want to insult anybody and say I don't recognize it. And that S not in a positive way. That S in a very negative way. And I love Europe and I want to see Europe go good, but it's not heading in the right direction." On the surface, that sounds like just Trump being Trump. Vague, rambling. I want to see Europe go good. What does that even mean? But here's what I realized after reading the international response. To Americans, this might sound like gibberish. To Europeans, especially older Europeans, this is a recognizable dialect, one they've heard before. One German commenter wrote, "Not recognizable equals rhetoric from the Alternative for Deutschland. That Germany's far-right party. The one that uses the same coded language the Nazis used about cultural purity and demographic threats. And that S, when it hit me. Trump was speaking in code, not complex code, obvious code if you know the history. He was talking about race while pretending to talk about culture. This rhetorical trick has a long history. Nazi ideology rarely relied solely on crude biological claims about racial superiority. That came later. First, they leaned heavily on the idea of culture, an ineffable civilizational essence said to belong organically to certain peoples and not to others. Trump's Davos speech echoed this pattern exactly. He insisted that Western greatness arose not from institutions, not from pluralism, not from democracy, but from what he called a very special culture that had lifted humanity from darkness to light. And this culture, he warned, was fragile, under threat. From what? Well, he never said it directly, but he made it clear. Migration, diversity, the other. He framed demographic change as civilizational erosion. Parts of Europe, he said, were now unrecognizable, as if diversity itself were a form of vandalism. Now I need to pause here and acknowledge something. Europe does have real challenges with immigration. Integration is complex. There are legitimate policy debates to be had. I am not denying that. But that is not what Trump was doing. He wasn't engaging in policy debate. He was doing something else entirely. He was treating migration not as a humanitarian reality or a policy challenge, but as an invasive force, as contamination. This is central to fascist thought. Outsiders are cast as pollutants, weakening the national body, and the language was careful, almost genteel, but the structure was unmistakable. Civilizations rise when they remain pure. They fall when they allow themselves to be mixed. This logic got even darker when Trump turned to the United States. He singled out Somali Americans. He recycled stereotypes about fraud, criminality, intellectual inferiority. He questioned their capacity to integrate, and by extension, he questioned the legitimacy of a multicultural society itself. Some cultures, he suggested, had never built anything of value. Therefore, they have no rightful claim to the West. This was not an accidental slip. This was a statement of hierarchy. Some peoples are bearers of civilization. Others are merely burdens upon it. Now, I know this sounds extreme. I know some of you might be thinking I am overreacting, that I am reading too much into rambling from a man who can barely string together a coherent sentence. But here is what stopped me: the international comments, specifically the ones from people who know this history intimately. One commenter wrote, "This is pure Nazi ideology. If some nations are civilization builders and others are not, we want a historical study of civilizations and how they were achieved, by their own intellect or by sucking the blood and resources of other nations. Let's see how well the white blue-eyed man scores." Another wrote, "Nazi racial theory divided humanity into creators, bearers, and destroyers of culture, with Aryans positioned as the sole true creators." Trump may not have used that language, but the implication was similar. And here's the thing. These aren't conspiracy theorists. These are people who grew up in countries where they teach you exactly how fascist ideology develops. They know the early warning signs because they were forced to study them. Never again means learning to recognize it before it's too late. One of the most powerful comments I read was from someone who said, "Trump keeps telling other leaders how to run their country. However, he can't even run the one he has a duty to." And that's true. But it's more than just incompetence. It's projection. America right now is becoming unrecognizable, not because of immigrants, because of Trump. An Australian commenter wrote, "People come back from USA and say they don't recognize it, and that's not in a positive way either." Think about that. The country that spent 70 years lecturing the world about democracy, freedom, human rights, that country is now conducting military-style raids where armed agents in unmarked vehicles disappear people on the streets, where a man and woman were shot to death in their car for the crime of being in the wrong place when ICE was hunting migrants. I don't recognize America anymore either. And I live here. But let me get back to Davos. Because the speech got worse, Trump invoked what he called Western civilization over and over, not as an idea, not as a system of government or values, but as an inheritance. Something you reborn into, something in your blood. Stephen Miller's influence was unmistakable throughout this speech. Miller has long promoted a mythologized history in which Western civilization is the exclusive achievement of white Europeans, a straight, sanitized line from classical antiquity to modern America. This narrative erases centuries of exchange, conflict, and hybridity in favor of an ethnic origin story. In this worldview, history belongs to our ancestors. Everyone else appears as an interloper. Diversity in this framework is not a demographic strength, it's a civilizational threat. And this thinking is not confined to the White House. Elon Musk has repeatedly amplified claims that white people face extinction. He has endorsed calls for racial solidarity as a matter of survival. The white replacement theory, once confined to extremist forums, has migrated into mainstream political discourse. And Trump's decision to offer asylum to white South Africans based on an imagined genocide fits perfectly into this worldview. Victimhood is racialized. Protection is selectively applied. Now here's something that multiple commenters pointed out, something I hadn't fully considered. Stephen Miller is Jewish. His ancestors were victims of the exact ideology he is now promoting. One commenter wrote, "Stephen Miller is a Jew, but he behaves like those who killed millions of his own people." Another said, "Miller is that piece of scum aware that in his own ideology 80 years ago he would be considered a race traitor and that he is genetically defective. The ignorance and lack of self-awareness is staggering." I don't know how to explain this except to say that sometimes the abused becomes the abuser. Sometimes the victim internalizes the oppressor's logic and redirects it at new targets. It's not rational. It's psychological. But it is also deeply, deeply dangerous. Because Miller understands exactly what he's doing. He knows the history. He knows where this leads. And he's doing it anyway. Let me tell you about the reaction in the room at Davos. According to reports, some delegates walked out. Others sat in stunned silence. European leaders looked genuinely alarmed. One commenter wrote, "Other leaders are far too quiet in the face of this rampaging Hitler." He belittled all of them at Davos, and they just sat meekly listening to his trash and insults about Europe. All my hopes died down with a whimper that day at Davos. And I understand that frustration. Where was the walkout? Where was the unified condemnation? But here's what I think happened. I think European leaders are caught between two terrible options. Confront Trump directly and risk American retaliation, tariffs, military withdrawal, or stay quiet and enable the normalization of fascist rhetoric. They chose to stay quiet, and I think they chose wrong. But I also understand why. Because Trump made threats at Davos too. He talked about Greenland. He insisted he wouldn't use force to take it. Then in the same breath suggested that America would end up with it one way or another. He called Denmark ungrateful. He described Greenlanders as effectively American by geography and destiny. When he warned that refusals would be remembered, the implication was unmistakable. Cooperation is optional. Consequences are not. This is mob language. Do this the easy way or do it the hard way. And remember, as he was saying all of this, there was a military aide standing near him carrying the nuclear codes. Let that image sit with you for a moment. A man who sees the world as a civilizational battlefield. A man who believes entire cultures are incompatible with modernity. That man commands the most destructive arsenal in human history. I want to read you some more comments because I think the international perspective is absolutely crucial here. A commenter wrote, "In my youth, 80% of Europeans loved America. Now, Trump destroyed it. All hate Trump, and 51% see America as enemy." Another said, "As we all know already, Trump is in the Epstein files so much he is scared that his sickness will be found out." All this bullshit to cover up Epstein files, that theory appeared again and again. And listen, I can confirm whether Trump is desperately creating international chaos to distract from the Epstein files. But multiple commenters believe that exactly what's happening. And the fact that the files remain unreleased, despite Trump's promise of transparency, certainly raises questions. But here's what I think is actually happening. I think Trump and Miller genuinely believe in this civilizational hierarchy. I think they actually see the world as a zero-sum competition between racial groups. And I think they reusing the power of the American state to advance that vision. This isn't distraction. This is the plan. One Canadian commenter wrote something that really stuck with me. They said, "As a Canadian living next to this fascist Nazi bullshit, the U.S. is lost. It is really bad and will get much worse. To protect our planet, the world must turn its back on the U.S." Another wrote, "It's time for blue states to think about joining Canada. Appeal to Canada to join the Dominion of Canada. Drop the dead weight of red states. Let them wallow in their hate and bigotry." Now that might sound extreme, but think about what they re-saying. They re-saying that the United States of America, the country that won World War II, that defeated fascism, that country no longer shares the values of the democratic world. And they might be right, because right now the United States is conducting ethnic cleansing operations on its own streets. ICE agents, who one commenter correctly called Trump's Gestapo, are terrorizing communities, separating families, and in at least one case that we know of, killing American citizens. Alex Preddy and Renee Good. Remember their names? They were shot to death in their car in Minnesota. The official story keeps changing. First, ICE said Alex had a weapon. Then they said he might have had a weapon. Now they re-saying they felt threatened, but we saw the footage. Alex was not brandishing a weapon. He had a phone. He was executed on American soil by agents of the American government for the crime of being in the wrong place when Trump's deportation machine came through. And you know what's most chilling? One commenter pointed out, Since the beginning of 2026, at least 6 people have died in U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement detention centers. This follows 2025, the deadliest year for the agency in 2 decades, when 32 detainees died. 32 people died in ICE custody last year. We're not even a month into this year and 6 more are dead. This is not normal. This is not acceptable. This is state violence on a scale we haven't seen in America since what? Jim Crow? The Indian Wars? Several commenters made comparisons to Nazi Germany in specific years. One wrote, "The USA has changed into a country that is starting to resemble Germany in 1933, at the beginning of World War II. Another said, "I don't recognize America anymore. I never imagined fascism could be so evident in 2026, the Constitution and freedoms so violently trashed." Now, I need to be careful here, because comparing anything to the Holocaust risks diminishing the unique horror of that genocide. 6 million Jews murdered, millions more Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, gay men, religious minorities. Industrialized death on a scale humanity had never seen. We are not there. We were not at the death camps. We were not at the gas chambers, but we are at 1933. We were at the point where a government starts defining certain groups as subhuman, starts treating them as invasive, starts removing them from society by force. And if you know your history, you know that 1933 was not the end point. It was the beginning. One German commenter wrote, "Love your show, my country went through this. Greetings and support from Germany." That sentence breaks my heart, because they re-offering us support. They re-trying to help us recognize what they failed to stop in their own country, and we re-not listening. Another commenter said, "Neither the appeasement policy of Chamberlain nor the Vichy regime during the occupation, it did not work then, it will not work now. Either you surrender to the thieves or you fight for the rule of law. You can go both ways. That is the choice. Appeasement or resistance. There is no middle ground with fascism. So what do we do? Because that's the question, isn't it? How do we stop this?" And here is where I get uncomfortable, because I don't have a good answer. Every peaceful mechanism, voting, courts, the Constitution, they've all failed or been corrupted. Multiple commenters ask the same question. How do we stop this without violence? One wrote, "These fascists now in power will not last for long. Then they should all be brought to trial in front of the whole world to set an example. They must be convicted and face the very hardest sentences, or this will all happen again." But others were less optimistic. One said, "The problem has never been Trump anyway, but the Republicans who refuse to do their job and be political guardrails and remove Trump from office." And that's true. Trump is a symptom. The Republican Party is the disease. They could end this tomorrow with impeachment. They won T because they re-complicit. But I want to focus on something different, something the international community is starting to do. Economic isolation. Multiple commenters called for boycotts. Boycott American products. Boycott the World Cup. Sell U.S. Treasury bonds. Expel American military forces. One Australian commenter wrote an entire template for contacting their government, demanding that Australia end intelligence sharing with the U.S., expel American forces, and terminate defense contracts until Trump is removed. A Canadian wrote, "Canada says enough is enough. Canada says never again fascism. Canada is back. This is unprecedented. These are America's closest allies talking about treating the United States as a hostile power, and I think they are right to do it, because the only language Trump understands is money and power. Moral arguments don't work. International norms don't work. But economic pressure might. If Europe, Canada, Australia all simultaneously started divesting from American markets, selling treasury bonds, imposing counter tariffs, Trump would feel that. It would hurt his billionaire backers. It would crater the stock market. It would expose the lie that he's making America strong. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. This would hurt ordinary Americans too. It would damage the economy. It would cause pain. You rewrite. It would. But what is the alternative? Let this continue? Let America slide further into fascism while the world watches? One commenter put it perfectly. We live in Africa. Trump is considered a total loser, weak, pathetic old man only interested in his money, even in Africa. Even in Africa. Think about that. The continent that America spent decades lecturing about corruption, about human rights, about democracy. That continent now looks at America with pity and contempt. We've lost the moral high ground. We've lost the trust of our allies. We've lost the respect of the world. And we did it in less than a month. Multiple commenters noted that this isn't really about Trump. One wrote, U.S. problem is not Trump. U.S. problem is the fact that psychopath like Trump can become president. Another said, the most devastating day in the history of the world was the day Trump was born. But I think the real problem is deeper. The problem is that 74 million Americans voted for this. They voted for a man who openly campaigned on retribution, on mass deportation, on civilizational warfare. Either they wanted this, or they didn't care enough to stop it. Either way, the world is taking notes. One commenter said something that haunted me. This doesn't end when Trump goes. America could easily vote for this again. Frankly, I have had a gut full of the divided states. They're right. Even if we remove Trump tomorrow, the damage is done. The world has learned that America is capable of electing a fascist, that American democracy is fragile, that American promises are worthless. You can unring that bell. So where does this leave us? What do I think happens next? I think it gets worse before it gets better. I think the deportation raids escalate. I think more people die. I think the international isolation intensifies. I think there is a real possibility of violence, not just state violence against migrants, which is already happening, but political violence, assassination attempts, maybe even domestic terrorism from both sides. I think the midterm elections, if they happen, will be contested and potentially suspended if Trump feels threatened. Multiple commenters speculated about martial law, and I think there's a chance, a real chance, that the United States fractures, that blue states start openly defying federal authority, that Canada seriously considers accepting American refugees, that the country that won the Cold War loses the peace. But here is what I also think. I think the American people are not the American government. I think the majority of Americans are decent people who are horrified by what is happening. International commenters recognize this. One wrote, I feel so sorry for normal Americans who have to deal with this insane orange baby. Another said, to all Americans who never supported him, they are held hostage by his terrible regime. The world knows. They know most of us didn't want this. They know we are trying to resist. They know we are scared. And that matters. Because when this is over, when Trump is finally gone, whether that's through impeachment or the 25th Amendment or natural causes or something else, we are going to need the world's help to rebuild. We are going to need their forgiveness, their partnership, their willingness to believe that America can be better. I don't know if we'll get it. I honestly don't. The damage is profound, but I know we have to try. We have to keep resisting, keep speaking out, keep documenting the atrocities, keep reminding the world that this is not who we are. Or rather, this is not who we want to be, because maybe this is who we are. Maybe this ugliness was always here, just beneath the surface. Maybe Trump didn't create American fascism. Maybe he just gave it permission to show itself. One commenter said, well, he's saying what many white people worldwide feel when it comes to race. And that's the most terrifying possibility. That Trump's vision of racial hierarchy, of civilizational warfare, of blood and soil, that it resonates because it taps into something deep and dark in the human psyche, the fear of the other, the desire for purity, the comfort of tribalism. If that's true, then this fight is bigger than Trump. It's bigger than America. It's the same fight humanity has been having since the beginning. Inclusion versus exclusion, pluralism versus purity, love versus hate. And I don't know who wins. History suggests the arc bends toward justice, but it bends slowly, and there's a lot of suffering along the way. What I do know is this. The people who should recognize fascism are screaming warnings at us. The Germans who grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust. The Europeans who rebuilt their civilization from rubble. The survivors who said never again and meant it. They retelling us that this is how it starts. This is what the early stage looks like, the coded language, the scapegoating, the dehumanization, the state violence. And if we don't listen, if we don't act, then we re-complicit in what comes next. So here's my call to action, and I'm going to give you multiple levels because I know not everyone can do everything. If you are an American and you have 5 minutes, call your representatives. Demand impeachment. Demand the 25th Amendment. Demand accountability for the deaths caused by ICE. Be specific. Use the names. Alex Preddy, Renee Good. Say their names. If you have an hour, organize. Join local resistance groups. Plan peaceful protests. Document ICE activity in your community. Create mutual aid networks to protect vulnerable people. If you have resources, donate to organizations doing frontline work. Immigration defense funds, civil liberties groups, independent journalism. If you re-international, pressure your government. Demand they take a stand. Economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation. Anything to show Trump that fascism has consequences. And to everyone, stop buying American products where you can. I know that hard. I know it hurts American workers who aren't irresponsible for this. But it is one of the few pressure points we have. Trump worships money. His billionaire backers worship money. If the economy crashes, if the stock market tanks, if American corporations start screaming about lost revenue, that when things might change, it's not pretty, it's not fair. But fairness is a luxury we no longer have. I'm going to end with one more comment that really stuck with me. Someone wrote, "The question is no longer whether Trump's politics echo fascist or Nazi-era ideas about race and civilization. The echoes are clear. The question is how far this vision of a purified West defended through coercion and myth will be allowed to shape global politics before it is confronted for what it is and resisted accordingly. That's the question. How far will we let this go? In 1933, the German people didn't know where it would lead. They thought it was just rhetoric, just nationalist posturing, just tough talk on immigration. By 1945, 60 million people were dead. We don't have that excuse. We know how this story ends. We've seen it before. The whole world has seen it. So the question is not whether we recognize it. The question is whether we have the courage to stop it. I don't know if we do. I hope we do, but hope is not a strategy. We need action. We need solidarity. We need resistance. And we need it now, before it's too late. This is not normal. This is not politics as usual. This is an emergency. And if we don't treat it like one, if we keep pretending that norms and procedures and civility will save us, then we're going to wake up one day in a country we don't recognize. Actually, scratch that. We were already in a country we don't recognize. The question is whether we were going to fight to get it back. I think we have to. I think we don't have a choice, because the alternative